So I think we'll begin, and thank you very much for joining us, and jump straight into the program and introduce the two guests that we have here. And I think when you released your new poll, Shibli, we were very keen to have you here, and the administration and Palestinian and Israeli leaderships were kind enough to make that coincide with the relaunching of negotiations. So there's obviously a topical twist to what we're talking about today with next week's events here in Washington. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Shibli Talhami, and I'm going to introduce Shibli momentarily, to give a little introduction, have my colleague Amjad respond, and we'll have a brief discussion here and then open that up to yourselves. Shibli Talhami, who's sitting to my left, is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at Maryland University. Shibli is also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, the Saban Center there. And as you were telling me just now, this is the 9th year in which you've been conducting this very in-depth polling of the Arab world. You take, I think, 6 Arab countries most years. And I'll come back to that in a second. I'll introduce Amjad, my colleague, Amjad Atala, who's sitting to my right. Amjad is the co-director here with me of the Middle East Task Force here at the New America Foundation. Amjad is someone who I know from previous Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations. Amjad was a founder of Women for Women International. He ran a think tank that he set up called Strategic Assessments Initiative. He was an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team and led the international part of the Save Darfur campaign before he was slapped back kicking and screaming into dealing with Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab and Arab world issues. Shibli, maybe you could, and obviously there is the poll that's accessible, people can get that online. You've now written a piece which, one of the hats that we wear, Amjad and myself, is as co-editors of something called the Middle East Channel at the Foreign Policy website, and you've now written this piece where you, I think, give some very smart advice to the administration in terms of what they should do next, and a way forward to try and actually win the confidence of both the Israeli and the Arab public. So maybe share with us both the key findings as you see them of that research that you've done, and take that through to next week and to the resumption of the talks and the meetings that will be held here.
Well, thanks so much for hosting me, and I'm looking forward to the open conversation, which is always more interesting than just a presentation. But let me put some of this in some perspective, and I'll start with an anecdote that I actually start the piece in Foreign Policy today with, which is, I go to the region quite often. I'm a student of the region for decades, really, separate from public opinion polls. And I certainly take the pulse both at the government level and the public level and write about it and have done it throughout. And so I have a pretty good sense usually of where the public is and what the sentiment is. And I make an assessment even separate from polling. But this particular trip, it was February actually, I was in Cairo. And I was invited to appear on a very popular show in Egypt called Al-Qahira Al-Yawm. And it was it's a highly watched show. They usually go through press clippings of the day on some issues and ask you to react. And so I went there. It was my first time on that show. And one of the questions immediately startled me because the way I read it, at least, it was there was a story in the Egyptian press that was apparently a translation of an article in the American press. I think it was the Washington Post, and it was about the sort of the private, spiritual, religious life of President Obama, consulting with ministers on regular basis. And so when he said, comment on that. And when I read immediately, I said the guy thinks maybe Obama is an evangelical Christian, a closet evangelical. And maybe his audience, just by virtue of the way he framed the question, is concluding maybe Obama is a secret evangelical. And that was kind of interesting because if you look back, particularly early after 9/11, how some people in the region interpreted Bush's foreign policy from the perspective of, quote, his apparent religiosity, or his comments about a crusade being supported by the religious right, and too much was made of that here and there. And so I was worried in some ways that was the conclusion that was being drawn, and it wasn't particularly hard for me to address that, and I did. But to my mind, I thought of it as a reflection of a changed mood in and of itself, because I think people reinterpret leaders depending on whether they like them or not, and the judgment on whether they like them or not precedes their "he's like me" or "he's different from me." And I think we ought to keep that in mind even here in the American debate. So it itself was a reflection of it. I think that to a large extent, Washington, and I think actually our public discourse, misinterpreted the way both Arabs and Israelis saw Obama and placed too much value on his personal characteristics. And let me tell you what I mean. Now, I think there was a judgment, if you read our press, particularly after the Cairo speech, that people in the region, Arabs in particular, but Muslims broadly, were in love with this man, that they were embracing him, that some people maybe also were taken by the fact that he had a Muslim father or had lived in a Muslim country in his childhood. And maybe that's what was framing their positions on him, and they were embracing him. Well, actually, there was no evidence of that at all. And if you look at the polls, not just the one that I did through Zogby International, but actually Pew and others at that time, when you look at their evaluation of him in the Arab world at least, in fact, the views were favorable of him. The ones that we did from almost 17 urban areas in 6 countries at that time, they were 45% had a favorable view of the president, which was stunning in some ways in comparison to what we were getting for Bush the year before, even last year actually, where he was being identified by majorities as the single most disliked leader in the world. So that was itself striking. But when you actually analyzed their attitudes about Obama, you found that they were primarily neutral. Yeah, they weren't very highly negative, but there were very few people who were saying they had a very highly favorable view of him. It was a small percentage. And most people who had a favorable view was a somewhat favorable view. And in Egypt, actually the largest segment they were neutral about him. And so it was much more neutral. In fact, when we asked, there's an open question that I repeat every year as a way of figuring out what the prism is through which they're looking at the world. I ask, whom among world leaders do you admire most? That's an open question. They can name anyone they want. It's not something that I give them a list of names and here choose among these. It's harder because sometimes you actually end up getting more than 100 names and maybe sometimes more than that, 200, where you have to just track that and you don't get large percentages. But we have people who get over 20%. And Obama wasn't anywhere near the top names. He never actually, even in the spring and of last year, he was not high. Nobody was identifying him as a most admired leader. He was never a most admired leader. People actually were interested in him. They were open to him. And I'll come back to why, because I think people misinterpreted that too. And we could see that already from the year before. The year before, actually, during the presidential campaign, I was out on a lecture tour across the region, including in Saudi Arabia, multiple places in Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and elsewhere in the Middle East. And I was getting a lot of questions about, sort of our presidential campaign, our candidates, Obama, Hillary Clinton, McCain. So I decided to ask a question during the campaign when McCain, Obama, and Hillary Clinton were still politically alive in that, whom they preferred, whom they thought would advance Middle East peace most of those 3 candidates. It wasn't a surprise that McCain didn't hardly get any support. It was the 3%, I believe it was, because he was people were aware of the framing that he was talking about, the threat, the Islamo-fascist threat that he used in his campaign. It was highly covered in the Arab world, and clearly he wasn't a favored candidate. But Hillary Clinton received 13% in that particular poll, and Barack Obama received 18%, not much more. And a plurality of Arabs during that campaign said none of the above, basically. They didn't have faith in the candidates. There was no embrace of Obama as a person. That's a myth, I think, it just didn't exist. And in fact, if you look closely at the issues that people embraced him for, it was very obvious. They liked the fact that he opposed the Iraq War, and that he then repeated that he was going to follow through with his campaign promise. They liked the fact that he said very quickly he was going to close Guantanamo and end torture, because many people in the region thought that was targeting them. And they certainly liked the fact that he said he was going to make Middle East peace a priority. Those are the issues. It was always about issues. It wasn't about anything else. And so what we've seen in the past year is essentially an evaluation of the administration. Now, when I say issues, there are multiple issues that Arabs care about, not just one, like any other people. But they see America through the prism of a limited number of issues. And those are usually the big foreign policy issues. And nothing ranks higher than the Arab-Israeli conflict in their evaluation. We've seen that year after year in the polls. Iraq War came close. In some years, in the heat of the Iraq War, it was really a top issue. And it still is an important issue. Because, in fact, when I ask in this current poll, what is the issue you're disappointed with most when it comes to the Obama administration, over 60% said the Arab-Israeli issue. And the next issue, over 20%, it was Iraq. And note, by the way, this is an interesting afterthought, which is that Afghanistan was not a high priority issue. Now, when I say that, it's not that people don't care about Afghanistan. Don't get me wrong. This is a ranking. With a ranking, it just tells you where are the passions. So they follow Afghanistan. It doesn't mean they're even happy with the administration's policy on Afghanistan. But what it does mean is that's not the issue that's going to be critical for them. For one thing, I think Arabs are not sure about what they want in Afghanistan, to be honest. They don't know enough. They don't like the Taliban. I'm not sure they like Karzai. They're worried about the American role. It's very conflictive. But separate from that, it's not the prism through which to look at America. And we've seen that in the past, where the evaluation of leaders is primarily seen through a limited number of prisms. The one really good example, I give that in the article, is of Jacques Chirac, who, when we were talking about civilizational clash and value clash and West and East and Christendom and the right in the middle of the heat of the Iraq War in 2004, 2005. In the question, identify the leader you admire most, the person who got the highest ratings was Jacques Chirac of France. And why would that happen in the middle of the controversy of the veil and the controversy related to the immigrants, many of whom are from Arab countries? It's because they saw him as opposing the Iraq War and hosting Yasser Arafat when Yasser Arafat was on, seriously ill and died actually in France, and received him like it had a state, and people rewarded him. And it was interesting because I was watching Al Jazeera during that period, and Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who is a scholar, as you know, is very influential of Islam, who has a program on Al Jazeera, and he got a question about, the French and the veil, and he couldn't bring himself to criticize the French. He diverted attention by saying, "What about Tunisia?" or something like that, And it's very interesting because I think it's, the prism is clear. That is the prism through which they're making a judgment. And I think what we haven't had internalized sufficiently, I think, in the Washington discourse is how much of an impact Gaza has had. Because, Obama comes to office at the tail end of the Gaza war. That has really galvanized the region. I mean, it was one that was viewed day in and day out for the duration. and they were expecting some transformation that they didn't see happening over the past year. So in some ways, Gaza has stayed, as a much more constant issue in the past year and a half in the Middle East discourse than it was here. It's as if it disappeared from our discourse, but it was front and center there. Now, I believe that at this point in time, it is really very difficult to envision a path to win Arab public opinion for the administration that does not go through an Arab-Israeli breakthrough. I just do not see it, because I think you can dance around issues, but in the end it comes back to this one in the minds of most. I happen to also believe that is also the prism through which Israelis see the United States. And I think that there is, in my own judgment, as also a student of Israeli politics, and I've written about Israeli foreign policy and visit and speak in Israel, as someone who is a student of Israeli society, I also believe that people misinterpreted how Israelis viewed Obama. I do not believe that people in the end were evaluating Obama on the basis of who he is. I think people look at the initial, in the absence of any information at all, as happened during the campaign. Obama was an unknown on foreign policy. It's very uncomfortable when you have people who are unknown. They already knew where Hillary Clinton was. They already knew where McCain was. And so they had an idea. Obama was, for one thing, unknown. And then you start looking for clues when you have unknowns. And they were uneasy about Obama. And that was reflected itself in the early assessment, even before any information was revealed and before the issue of the Reverend Right came into play with Israel. I believe people can have an initial instinct. It changes over time. When you look back at how Arabs and Israelis viewed American leaders, in fact, this has dramatically changed over the past couple of decades. George W. Bush was favored by the Arab when he was elected. If you look back at the 2000 elections, in 2000, when we were in the heat of the Gore-Bush competition for presidency, the sentiment in the Arab world, we don't have really good polling on that, but certainly the evidence that we're getting from the media, from leaders, from talking to people, was that Arabs were very much rooting for Bush to win. And they were rooting against Gore. And the Israelis were passionately rooting for Gore-Lieberman for more than one reason. One reason, obviously, was they liked the Clinton administration. The Israelis were in love with Bill Clinton. And Gore was his vice president. But the other was, of course, Lieberman, who was the vice presidential candidate. So they were embracing the Gore-Lieberman campaign. Arabs were rooting for Bush. And it took only a few months before Bush becomes something of a hero in Israel and the most disliked leader in the Arab world. So so it doesn't matter. Those things change based on what you do. And I happen to think that the Israeli public in general is uncomfortable with Obama's foreign policy, not just for what he did or didn't do on the peace issue. I'm going to come back to the peace issue in a minute. But I think they're uncomfortable with his overall foreign policy, with his overall paradigm. And that, I think, has to do more with the fact that Israelis, for reasons that should be clear over the past decade, have taken comfort in the kind of paradigm that was painted by George W. Bush. The unilateralism, a framing of the terrorist issue that led to a discourse in the U.S. that linked Islam and extremism in the discourse. And certainly in the early part of the Bush administration, that didn't highlight the Arab-Israeli issue as important in America's priorities. And I think if you look at the Israelis, for all their strength, and they are militarily strong, Israel is arguably the most powerful military state in the Middle East, certainly in terms of conventional and nuclear. And it does occupy Palestinian territories. But I think Israelis are deeply insecure. And I think as a nation, Israel is deeply insecure. And I think the mindset of the Israeli public is one of deep insecurity. And in times of crisis, that insecurity defines their outlook on almost every issue. And over the past decade, I think the Israelis in the 1990s believed, in essence, they had won a war with the Arabs, just like the U.S. had won the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Won not in a zero-sum way, but that the conflict was coming to an end in ways they could live with. And that was really sort of the general sentiment of much of the 1990s. I think Arabs thought, by and large, the Arab-Israeli conflict is coming to an end. I think most people around the world, including people who didn't like the ending, thought that it was coming to an end. But after the failure in 2000 and the rise of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, everything changed in terms of the perceptions, both in terms of Palestinians mobilizing Arab and Muslim support, and people say it's not over, and now it's a zero-sum game again. But also on the Israeli side, where I think particularly with the suicide bombings and the Palestinians' ability to mobilize support from the international community, there was a sense that this was what most Israelis define as an existential crisis. And with it, they were very much protective of a consolidating relation with the U.S. as an anchor at all costs at a time when the game was defined as zero-sum. When 9/11 came, it added another layer of that. And the layer was very obvious, which is the horrific attack on the U.S. raised fears in Israel that maybe American support for Israel would be blamed for that. It would be blamed for the attack, and therefore would reduce the American commitment to Israel. So when George W. Bush puts out the framing, they hate us for our values, that was comforting in Israel at the level of the Israeli public. Very comforting, because it meant that there was a paradigm that was not threatening to the relationship. And I think they grew comfortable with that paradigm, left to right, people who didn't really think about the analysis of what's going on so much, but it was a degree of comfort that people took it. And so when you have an administration which comes in and says, I'm going to take Islam out of the war on terrorism, I'm going to be multilateral, which means I'm going to rely more on international organizations, which means I may not be able to veto certain resolutions that Israel might actually depend on. And you say the Arab-Israeli issue is an important interest, even vital interest to the U.S., you're elevating in a way that frightens the Israeli body politic. And I think for that reason, even aside from the issue of settlement, the Israeli government, there's a paradigm that the Israelis haven't, that the Israelis are very uncomfortable with, that this administration brought. And I think that's the basic discomfort. And I don't think it's about Obama going to Israel. Obama could have gone to Israel and gave a wonderful speech, parallel to the one he gave in Cairo. It might have bought him a couple of weeks, but then you go back and you're going to evaluate people on their policies, not on what they said. Just like Arabs now, who listened to the speech and liked it, are now reacting actually quite the opposite. And so I think the issue was never really about personalities as such. Those matter early on, but in the end, it's about policies. I think there's suspicion in the Arab world, and there's suspicion in Israel. That's what we face. And that's the bad news. But let me give you some good news story. The good news, one of the good news stories is that, in fact, people think that if you can't win public opinion, then the game is over. I don't. I happen to think that most transformations that happen actually happen before you have a full transformation of public opinion. If you look, for example, what happened in Camp David between Israel and Egypt, there was no preparation in public opinion, really. Sadat goes to Jerusalem, that creates momentum, then there's the agreement, that shifts. Israel and the Palestinians, the Oslo Agreement, negotiated secretly. People didn't trust each other. The public was suspicious. The Israeli public thought of the PLO as a terrorist organization. It happened, the public came around. So I happen to believe that publics come when you put something serious under their noses. And we see in the polls the following interesting trends that reinforce that picture. On the one hand, certainly in the Arab world, but also in polling among Israelis and Palestinians, majorities, in fact, in the Arab world, over 2/3, consistently, by the way, over the past several years, we have a trend on that, of the people that we poll in these 6 countries say that they're in principle supportive of a two-state solution. So even in this ugly picture, you still have people who are in principle supportive of a two-state solution. What kind? That's another argument. But certainly in principle, not opposed to it. But there is a second thing, which is that a majority also say it will never happen. So they're pessimistic. And so in effect, they go into a zero-sum competition because they don't think it's going to happen. So they set themselves up for a failure rather than for success. But the third element that is also interesting is that when you ask people, so, okay, well, if the two-state solution collapses, what do you think will happen? Do you believe that there will be one state? Do you believe that the Palestinians are just going to give up? Or do you believe that there will be almost indefinite conflict, extended conflict for years to come? And the overwhelming majority say there will be conflict for years to come. And so you have people who they're prepared to accept a two-state solution. They don't see an alternative to it, but they're pessimistic that it'll never happen. And even more, when you ask them, well, if it's ever going to happen, do you think it's going to happen through war? It's going to happen through international imposition or American imposition? Or it's going to happen through negotiations? A plurality say it's through negotiations. So interestingly, you have a complex public sentiment that is far more receptive to an agreement if one is put before them, but they're pessimistic about its prospects, both because of what they've seen in the process so far and because they don't trust the other side. And for that reason, I would say, if I were advising the Obama administration, I would say to them, put aside Arab and Israeli public opinion for now. It's a lost game in the short term. Put it aside. Just build an agreement, and they will come. And with that.
Well, first of all, thank you for the comments and especially the provocative ending, which I'm going to turn to Amjad. I just want to pick up a couple of points on the Israeli public opinion. I basically agree with you. One thing I would add to that is I think part of this sense of Obama's unpopularity in Israel is somewhat of a myth. I think there were a couple of polls designed and conducted in order to show, mainly for domestic political reasons back in the USA, designed to show that this president was dramatically unpopular. And we went and tested that as New America to see whether that indeed was the case. And it was a 41 to 37 approval, disapproval rating in Israel, which I think you probably grab with both arms right now in America. I also think there has been a shift. The Israeli public has moved to the right. Demographically, Israel looks different to in many ways to how it did under Clinton. I very much agree with you on the framing, though. That I do think there was a certain convenience during the Bush presidency to a message which essentially boiled down to they hate us for who we are, not what we do. And that, it's not you, it's them. And that basically meant the weight was off Israel in terms of in the 90s, it wasn't you're all bad and they're fine. In the 90s it's okay. There are things that Israel is doing that are counterproductive, that is generating the problems that Israel faces, and it was almost a way to get out of that. I fundamentally fundamentally agree with you on your last point. I think right now, a presidential visit to Israel just to make nice would essentially, to use the professional lexicon, be dissed by the Israeli public. And I think if the president comes out with something assertive and takes the lead, I think that would be a way to gain people's respect. But Amjad, maybe pick up from where Shibli left off, and maybe work from next week backwards in terms of your responses, or do something else if you had something else planned.
No, actually, I think that's fine. I want to note, though, that when I first met Daniel, he was a negotiator for the Israeli negotiating team under Ehud Barak, and I was a legal advisor for the Palestinian negotiating team. And it was never difficult to get us together for dinner. And in light of all of the drama spending over the last 6 months attempting to get President Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu together for a high-profile dinner in the White House, I think it shows you just how far backwards the Oslo process, because this is firmly in the Oslo process, how far backwards the Oslo process has moved. Now, I want to start with your thesis, your basic thesis, and say I agree with it, but I have a hypothesis that you can extend it to the United States and to politics inside the United States. There's been, it seems, a pattern of behavior among the right wing in the United States and those who are opposed to President Obama to take extraordinarily right-wing positions, more right-wing than they took under Bush. Because the president seems to take a Solomonic approach to solving problems, he looks at the principled realist position, the principled national interest position. He looks at the extreme right-wing position, and then he cuts the baby in half. And the extreme right-wing effectively has responded to this by putting on jogging shoes and running further to the right, because they recognize that they can move the president along. And this has been on a number of domestic issues, whether it's the hysteria about terrorist anchor babies in July or welcoming Ramadan by the terrorist Islam narrative that came up in August. I think that there'll probably also be a terrorist peace process narrative that wing will adopt if the president attempts to pursue an end of the occupation. But if he's going to succeed, he has to pursue an end of the occupation. And there's probably no way that the president is going to win the public opinion race with the extreme right wing by cutting the baby in half and trying to adopt something in between Bantustan and freedom for the Palestinians and for the Israelis. And so I think that that's probably advice that he can use here as well, because the moment he does have a peace agreement, the moment that American interests are secure, Israel is secure, and the Palestinians are secure, I suspect that the overwhelming majority of Americans are going to applaud him and be standing behind him. And just two quick other points. It seems to me that just as we were thinking of Afghanistan and Iraq as Bush's wars, and President Obama has sort of firmly kept Iraq as Bush's war, but he's adopted Afghanistan as Obama's war, he's now adopted the Oslo process. He's adopted the Oslo process as his process. It's no longer the Clinton process. It's no longer Oslo. It's really Obama. He has spent all of this time effectively attempting to jumpstart the process that has been in existence since 1991. He hasn't tried to come up with a new process. He hasn't attempted to come up with a new methodology or a new strategic approach. He has simply attempted to take the corpse of the old process over the finish line. And now it's his. Now it belongs to Obama, and it therefore belongs to the United States. And I wondered from the poll results that you had, and I went through your poll, and I thought, again, it was a great, a really useful tool to use in trying to understand what's going on. How much more now will the United States have to pay if we fail in this process? Because it seems that the Arab world very firmly is saying, we aren't empowered to resolve this problem. This problem is going to be resolved through negotiations. Negotiations, I'm going to guess, with quotes around it, means U.S. intervention in order to end the conflict. And so, in many ways, if the United States can't resolve it, does this mean for the majority of the Arab world and the Muslim world, effectively, that the United States is a spent force. I mean, whatever else the United States can do, whatever else, we can bomb countries, we can give aid to countries, we can sell weapons to countries, but we can't actually end the occupation of Syrian and Palestinian territory. Therefore, we're not a positive force in the region. We can't play any positive role in the region. And that leads me just to my final quick point. It seems to me that the Arabs that have been allied, the Arab leaders that have been allied with the United States, and the Palestinian leaders that fall into that camp as well that have been allied with the United States, have effectively taken a Tariq bin Ziyad approach. They've crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, they've set fire to the boats, and they've said there's no going back. Now, the boats that they've set fire to are effectively the boats between them and their public opinion. They've effectively said, you know, we are saying the United States is the answer. The United States is the answer. There is no other solution. There is no other way to resolve this dispute. There's nothing that we can do. It's the United States. They need a plan B, it seems to me, because I certainly want President Obama to succeed in this coming year. I think everybody in this room probably wants President Obama to succeed. The odds, if we were going to take a Jeffrey Goldberg approach and just create an imaginary percentage number of success.
Jeffrey Goldberg, by the way, writes for The Atlantic, had a little noticed piece on Iran.
Right. We can say that let's say that there's a 50-50 chance that the United States can succeed. If the United States can't succeed, if we don't have the political will to actually end the occupation, then what do Arab leaders who've been aligned with the United States, where do they go from there? What narrative can they present? Because there are certainly people who are America's detractors who have presented a counter-narrative, which is that either resistance can succeed or standing up to the United States will succeed, and then there's been civil society, which has said that basically through boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, we can succeed. There's been the nonviolent resistance among the Palestinians, among civil society, but not necessarily among either Hamas or Fatah's leaderships. Where do they go from here?
And I'll take a rider on Amjad's question and add this. One of the things that got more headlines from your poll findings was how the Arab world, much contrary to what is normally taken here for conventional wisdom, and again the difference that Amjad pointed out between where the publics are at and where the leaderships are at, how the Arab world is viewing Iran. And that question of who's going to set the agenda in the Middle East next year, is it going to be, and I'm talking from here in the States, is it going to be those who are basically trying to depict this president of having a binary choice of we're going to pin you down as an appeaser, or you're going to show some metal on Iran with all that implies, or is this president going to lead this process? And you took the poll, obviously, before last Friday's announcement. I imagine that wouldn't have moved the dial at all in the president's favor. But as Amjad implied, has that now created a new expectation, which if it is failed to be met, could be worse than not having done it at all for the U.S.?
Yeah, these are really all good questions, and I'm just going to give you, sort of my thought on this, because, and also sort of where I am intellectually on the way the politics works in the Middle East. Obviously, I study public opinion, but I come from realist roots, and I know how governments behave. What drove my entire project 20 years ago was that I wrote an article about the 1991 Iraq War for Security Studies in one of our academic journals, and I reflected. I argued in that piece that one of the things that were misunderstood about Saddam Hussein's calculations was that he actually, in his mind, thought the anti-Americanism in the Middle East, which he read somewhat correctly. People don't realize there was very much anti-Americanism in the Middle East in the spring of 1990. I documented it myself. Actually, I wrote a report for Congress because I was at the time advising Congressman Lee Hamilton on the Hill. And I went to the region and I gave a picture of what was happening at that time. that Saddam Hussein thought that public anger with America over the Palestine issue could be mobilized in some way to prevent Saudi Arabia in particular from allowing American forces on its soil. That in his mind was America was going to come to war, but he could deal with an air war. He thought that ground war would be harder for America, but he thought that his Arab neighbors would be intimidated by public opinion, or public opinion would be mobilized in a way that would prevent them. And it didn't happen. So I ended up writing another piece following that on the gap, why, under what circumstances is public opinion mobilized in the Arab world, and how do governments deal with it? I wrote a piece for Political Science Quarterly on that issue. And it was then that I started thinking about ways in which public has an impact, but not direct impact, and particularly over time, and how do I study it in a sustained fashion. And so it came out of a realism, if you wish, about how states behave. And governments in the region have been able to behave in ways that were independent from their public, and they still do, largely through repression. But what it has done, of course, over time is it has done two things. One is that it perpetuated authoritarianism. One of the outcomes of it is that sort of, if you push that always, then how are people going to do it without perpetuating authoritarianism? It's been one of the outcomes. And second, radicalization on the margins, and in some instances, people going in another direction. Now, that's the issue, of course, that they all worry about. And on the Iran issue, I think there is a little bit of misunderstanding. There's no question that the Arab states who are genuinely concerned about Iran, particularly its neighbors, and like the UAE, and others who clearly want a tough position on Iran. But frankly, a lot of the Arab states who worry about Iran, like Egypt and Jordan and Morocco and others, are not worried about Iran's military so much. They're worried about Iran's political influence. And they're worried about the polls that say that people are sympathetic with Iran's allies, with Hezbollah, or Hassan Nasrallah is a popular leader, or Hamas is getting support in various Arab countries, and even Iran, in this case, openness to Iran's nuclear program, that people, in essence, support that, then they become very uncomfortable with Iran. And so a lot of these countries see Iran as a threat, largely because its ability to mobilize people who are alienated and frustrated with the Arab-Israeli issue. And that's why they see the Arab-Israeli issue as the path to containing Iran, not the other way around. They don't see attacking Iran as a way of resolving the Arab-Israeli issue because of that dynamic between public and government. In this year, it's interesting because I've tracked that over 3 years, actually over more than 3 years, but I compared the 3 years on a couple of issues. One, I asked a question about do you believe that Iran should be pressured to stop its nuclear program, or do you think that Iran has a right to its nuclear program? And we have seen from last year to this year an increase in the number of people who say Iran should has the right to its nuclear program. In fact, a majority say that. And what's interesting is that the year before Obama came to office, the number of people who wanted to put pressure on Iran was higher than the year Obama came to office, which was an optimist year about the Arab-Israeli issues. You can see over the 3 years a correlation that one can assume is related. Obviously, this is preliminary kind of projection, but that there is a relationship. And one of the other questions I ask is, do you believe that if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, would that be more positive or more negative for the region, or would it make a difference? And there's been an increase in the number of people who said it would be more positive overall. And the weighted averages, it was a majority. It varied from country to country dramatically. I mean, clearly in the UAE, a majority think it wouldn't be positive, but in Egypt, a majority think it would be positive. So there's a variation, but overall in the weighted average, there's much more sympathy. That worries governments. Now, can governments, let's say we fail to achieve peace. The administration diplomacy falls apart. And we have an escalation, such as another intifada, and then we know the horrors for both Israelis and Palestinians when you have that. What will happen? I mean, that's the question. So what would happen? Well, two things. One, I think we're at the end of the line on the two-state solution. Separate from America's role, I think we're running out of time. It's either going to happen or not. And if it doesn't happen on this administration's clock, we're really into a whole new ball game in the region. How people define it, where they go from there, I don't know. But it's going to be a period of instability by default because people don't know what the reference point is going to be. Second, on U.S. foreign policy, I think people will give up because you have a certain expectation that did come with Obama. And there is an assumption if this administration cannot do it, who will? And therefore, I think there is that kind of giving up and being sort of becoming, the U.S. becoming somewhat irrelevant in the thinking about the options. And the third thing has to do more with governments. Now remember, governments have their own interests, and they all, first and foremost, want to stay in power. I mean, let's not have any illusions about that. And if they have to contain the publics, they will contain the publics, and they will do what they have to do to contain the publics. And this is, no matter what happens, they're still going to have interest with the U.S. The U.S. is still the biggest player in the region by virtue of its military presence and economic relations and political support. And many players are going to have to find a way to work with the U.S., undoubtedly. Whether they will be able to do it with the changing environment remains to be known. I think it'll lead to a period of instability. It happens at a time when there's something else going on that we haven't brought up here, which is not just a transformation in regional politics, where you have, in essence, the power of the Arabs as a region has declined by virtue of the rise of Turkey as a major player in the region, the empowerment of Iran, the decline of Iraq. And there is a sense in the Arab world of marginalization that is happening by virtue of that empowerment. So there is an attitude across the region that Arabs are not as influential as they would like to be. And it happens at a time when Egypt is going through what is going to be a critical transition, the post-Mubarak transition. Now, that's absolutely critical because I think Egypt has been an anchor of the political order for the U.S. in the region. It's taken for granted. The Israelis too. It's taken for granted because it's been stable. That relationship has been unbelievably stable since Camp David. The relationship between Israel and the U.S., the relationship between Egypt and the U.S., and between Egypt and Israel. The ups and downs, tensions, but remarkably stable. If that, in a transition period where you have public pressure that is pervasive, an eruption on the Arab-Israeli issue that involves Gaza and its relationship with Egypt, and a giving up on the U.S. in the Arab public mind, I think it's going to be a mix that's going to be very hard, I think, for the U.S. and for the region.
No, I think something you refer to comes out very strongly in the poll in terms of the most popular leader, which is Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey. In many respects,
that doesn't make any Arab leader happy.
Exactly. Well, I think in many respects, what you see is the two competing ideologies. It's not as I see it. What we're told here, it's the extremists and the moderates. There's no moderate narrative of the Egyptian regime, for instance, that is trying to gain traction in the Arab world. It's a Turkish version of proud diplomacy based on democratic legitimacy, or it's the resistance narrative. And you see that played out. I want to briefly push you, Amjad, on one issue and raise one issue for both of you to get a brief response on so that we can then open it up. And that's to pick up on something that you said, which I agree with, of course, that there's no distinctive Obama administration approach to the peace process. It's, to me, the most stunning thing for the last 20 months has been the extent to which it's all being done exactly the same as how it has been done in the past, and it's failed in the past, even up to the presence of who's the guest list for dinner next Wednesday night. It's the Egyptian and Jordanian leaders. and it's going back to the parties negotiating. Briefly, I want to ask you, how would you do it differently? What would your advice be to the administration after we go through the ceremonials of next week? And then I want you to both briefly comment on something that is obviously very much in the headlines and I'm sure is having an impact in terms of how the Arab and Muslim world is viewing the US and in terms of what the US can be doing over there, which is what seems like a very disturbing rising tide and politically instrumentalized in the most irresponsible ways, tide of Islamophobia and Muslim bashing here, obviously based on Part 51 and the community centre being developed near the strip joint that's also close to Ground Zero.
Yes. I think on your first question, the administration has two choices as it goes into these direct talks. Is it going to be a facilitator for these talks, or is it going to be a negotiator at these talks with the two other parties? If so far the United States has chosen to be a facilitator. The Israelis have this position. We understand that this is the Israeli position. The Palestinians have this position. The United States has actually no vested interest in this conflict. We're going to listen to both sides, hear what their positions are, and we're going to see if we can't convince them through the dynamics that happen when you put people at a table together, if they can't somehow come to a conclusion with each other. The other approach the United States has taken in the past has been to actually be Israel's lawyers, as Aaron David Miller has so thoughtfully put out, that the United States can just take and adopt Israel's position and then lobby for it among the Palestinians. So those are the two precedents that the United States can follow. And it appears that the Obama administration, right now at least, is pursuing the facilitation approach. There's a third approach, which is for the United States to go into this as a negotiator, that the United States is the third party that has vital vested national interests in this conflict. The United States is the third combatant in this conflict. Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory, and let's all face it, it's impossible without the United States. We make that possible. The existence of the Palestinian Authority is a function of American policy and European and American largesse. We make that possible as well. For us to go into this process pretending that we are just simply a facilitator who's attempting to have the two parties air out two completely different perspectives on what a resolution looks like, and then believe that that process will somehow lead to a conclusion, I think, is just going to make everyone very unhappy at the end of the day. For the United States to go into this with a very aggressive negotiating posture for itself, that it's negotiating with Israel, it's negotiating with the Palestinians, it's negotiating with the Arabs, and then when it can get those pieces tied closely together is when they drag them all back in for that final meeting to hash everything out and sign the paperwork. And you've seen this, by the way. When the United States wanted to resolve the war in Bosnia, there were negotiations for 3 years prior to when the Dayton process started. There were negotiations that the Europeans were hosting between the Bosnians and between Yugoslavia and between the fascists who were engaged in the genocide. And those talks didn't work. They weren't going anywhere. They weren't succeeding. They just drove everybody crazy, convinced the Bosnians that there was no hope that they'll ever have that they'll be able to end the genocide peacefully. It was only when the United States took over the process, very ham-handedly, very, very ham-fistedly perhaps, but actually forced through a solution, that they all had to grumble and accept an agreement. I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily the exact approach, but it can't be the facilitation or the legal representation of Israel's position approach. It's got to be something more than that.
Maybe relate.
And just at the end, the Muslim the Muslim hysteria that's going on in the United States. I think the Muslim hysteria that's been engineered tapped into a reservoir of deep-seated antipathy and concern about Islam in the United States that, as a Muslim, I personally had assumed didn't exist. So I have to admit, somebody referred to this as the new anti-Semitism, and I think that that's absolutely right. I mean, that I can better empathize, as much as I studied Jewish persecution in Europe, certainly before World War II, but the pogroms and then the lead up to persecution. those types of sentiments, the type of hatred that's promoted regularly, and its pervasive effect on the body politic. When I watch the news and I watch CNN, think that having Reverend Graham say the most ridiculous, outlandish things about Islam on the one hand, and then they bring some scholar on the other hand, is this true? And this is their kind of even-handed approach to it. That kind of narrative that's being created, I think, will ultimately have a trickle-down effect, regardless of whether it's going to have an immediate impact on, and I think it really unravels everything that President Bush tried to do, ironically enough, when he attempted to disassociate Islam as a religion from the attacks on 9/11. Now, is it a temporary phenomena? Will there be a new cause du jour next month? I'm not sure, because the polling numbers for the right wing look good by attacking Muslims. They weren't so good by attacking anchor babies, attacking Hispanic Americans, Latino Americans. That wasn't playing as well as they hoped. But attacking Muslims is playing well, and so I think that they'll probably stay with it until there's something that works better for them. And I am afraid that the president, this is one of those times where a teachable moment by the president.
President Bloomberg.
President Bloomberg sounds good right now. But that would be, President Obama could use a teachable moment here to actually make an impact not only in America, but to make an impact overseas by making clear where American values are, by making clear where American constitutional principles are. He's chosen not to do that so far. But one way or another, this year is going to be very, very complex for the president, and his entire team is going to have to play at a different level than it has been playing for the last year and a half.
Well, just on that point, very quickly, which is, I think the administration understands that what has been tried out over the past year is going to be different when you commence the negotiations, and I think that they've talked about putting forth bridging proposals, ideas. Personally, I don't think if you leave Israelis and Palestinians without aggressive mediation, meaning putting ideas on the table to deal with final status issues in this state of affairs that they're in, there's no chance of an agreement. And I don't think anybody has an illusion. I think the administration has not yet been tested in its mediation effort, frankly, because the president, of course, has believed always from day one that this is an important issue for the U.S. and even defined it as vitally important in one of his comments. But you cannot play a hand when you have a structure. And I think that one of the frustrating things for the administration has been that they hadn't been able to put a viable structure where you can test the parties and see where they are, and before you can put any ideas, you have to find out where they are and what could be achieved. So whether or not they will do it, I don't know. I can't predict that. But I think there's an intent to do that. I think there's an understanding it has to be done. And if it's not, it's not going to work. It's just as simple as that. Now, on the linkage to the Islamophobia here, obviously this played in the Arab world before. It's a little bit different this time, I think. It's a little bit different because in some ways, it works both ways. We've had a year of walking away from the Islamophobia, in the national discourse. So people have adjusted themselves a little bit to a reduced rhetoric on that came after the election of President Obama and his even reframing of the war on terrorism. And yet now they discover it's not gone and it's coming back. So I think it's going to have an impact. Although I've also scanned the press to see, what I saw. Also, Mark Lynch had a blog on foreign policy, scanning the press, which is roughly right, which is that it's not the hottest issue in the Arab discourse, but it's mostly negative as being reported. Part of the reason why it's not the hottest issue is while the president could do more, as Amjad said, and maybe should, he at least is not one that's leading that and has taken a position early on that Muslims have a right to this. And obviously people like Bloomberg, like Mayor Bloomberg, have taken that position. It's been covered. So, but I think it's obviously a fueling issue. And I think in the end, if we were making progress on Arab-Israeli peace, this would be a far more side issue. If we're not, then all of this is going to add up. It's going to be adding fuel to the fire. And they'll start looking at Afghanistan more, and they'll start looking at this more, and Iraq more, and all of the. And sometimes we get lost in this fog of issues because there are a lot of issues, and they will dump on them, but they're not the driving issues for them. And even this one is not the driving issue for them, not in the Arab world.
The remarkable thing, of course, is on the day that you brought out this poll, which again proved something that basically everyone knows, the New York Times manages to run an op-ed by Ephraim Karsh that says, the Arab world doesn't give a damn about the Palestinians, it's an irrelevance. Well, that's the parallel universe that they sometimes live in. We'll open this up, and if people can introduce themselves, and especially if you're kind of sitting in the back half of the room, work hard to make yourself seen. Jonathan, if we take 2 questions here on either side of the aisle, right by the aisle, one you just walked past and one you're walking towards. The woman next to you. Sorry. Yes.
Dina El-Shanawi, Al Jazeera English. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good
Thanks
afternoon.
for having us. President Obama insisted at first on a total freeze on Israeli settlement activities, then was satisfied with a partial and limited freeze, and then pressured Palestinians to go to direct talks with no preconditions. What's your opinion on, how would that weigh more in the Arab mentality and belief that Israel is pressuring the U.S. and not vice versa? Thank you.
And we'll take a couple of questions to begin with. There was one. Yeah.
My name is Lee Diamond. I'm an activist here. I strongly support the Islamic Center. I'm trying to. I followed this a long time. I'm trying to understand. What does Israel want? What is Israel, when Israel looks at the whole situation, what is it they think they can get out? It seems to me they're out of touch with reality. So I guess my question is, are they out of touch with reality, and why? And where are they going? Where do they think they're going?
Yeah, we'll start with that.
Yeah, we'll start with that.
Well, let me start on the Obama and settlement. Obviously, when I did, just if you look at the change in the poll in the Arab world from the spring of 2009 to the summer of 2010, among people I polled in 2009, 45% had a favorable view of the president, somewhat favorable view of the president, and the remarkable thing in 2009 was also that you had a majority who were, for the first time, somewhat optimistic about American policy in the Middle East. That was actually rather amazing if you look at the decade prior. So what we see this year, because of the perception that you articulated of how people read what actually transpired, we have a real reversal on that. And that's the point, is that people are evaluating it largely through what's happening on the issue of Palestine. That's all I hear when I go and speak out in the region, and people are they see me as supportive of the administration, which I am. I'm a backer of this administration, and yet they dump on me, and all I hear is this issue on the Arab-Israeli issue. So they're now overwhelming majority is pessimistic about the American policy in the Middle East. And Obama's approval ratings in that poll, among those polled in the 6 countries, went from 45% to 20% of those who have a somewhat favorable view of the president. So there's no question that it had an impact. That's the way the public is seeing it. And obviously, all I can say is that the administration has only one advantage in starting these negotiations now, is that people don't believe that it's going to lead anywhere. And that gives them a little bit of leeway to surprise people.
Nina, thanks for the question. I think there was a choice. Our colleague Steve Clements here wrote a piece last year in which he actually said that Obama needs to make sure that he's the one who defines Netanyahu, not having Netanyahu define Obama. And over the year, I think Netanyahu has successfully, at least among the Israeli public, shown that he is defining Obama's policy rather than vice versa. I'm positive that the process that will continue, that the process that will commence next week will fail if that continues. If Netanyahu can continue to define President Obama and his policies, In particular, I mean, the president, it's an irony of the way it works. You don't actually get points for standing up for principle if you then give up principle. You only get credit for standing up for principle if you can stay with it. And so the president can't pick up fights that he's not prepared to stay with. We'll find out very shortly whether Netanyahu actually has a secret peace plan in his body or not. But if we find out that he doesn't, does that mean that President Obama's plan becomes closer to the non-plan of Netanyahu, or does that mean that the United States forces the issue? And I think that that's a contest that will have ramifications for President Obama and for the United States throughout the Middle East, not just in Israel. He can't allow himself to continue to be defined by the most extreme elements in Israeli society. We're not even talking about what this is doing to the Israeli center. I mean, imagine if you're the Israeli center and you want to engage, you want to support the U.S. government, you support a two-state plan, but the United States continues to support the extreme right-wing government. And so the public says, well, why? How can you be more? If the United States is willing to give up on this, why would you be making noise? And so this next year is all important.
Do you want to address the thing on what Israel wants, or I could also say something about that?
If you keep it brief.
Yeah, I think that what does Israel want is obviously one that everybody thinks about, but I don't think there is one answer to it. I think Israel is very complex, and I think you have to focus on two levels. At one level, I think, despite the move to the right in Israeli body politic, which has really occurred over a lengthy period of time, you still have, in principle, support to conclude a two-state agreement. And I believe, actually, that most often leaders underestimate the power of decision. That I believe that once leaders make a decision on tough issues, they'll sway 20-25% of the public that has been on the fence into that camp. So I think that there's a capacity at the public level. There's a capacity to accept an agreement. The question is, obviously, then, when we speak, is what does the Israeli government want? And obviously people have different interpretations of it, in part because it's a complex Israeli coalition, and it's very hard to interpret what is the strategy of the Israeli government. But if you are a mediator, like the U.S., and you have a government, any government, in the Arab world or in Israel, and you're dealing with an issue of mediation, you cannot go into it assuming that they're not going to play. But you have to be aggressive in testing it very quickly. And you have to be prepared in case people aren't going to play. And that's the strategy you go with. But you cannot go with a closed mind. You really have to go with it. You have to internegotiate with the sense that there are possibilities.
Clearly, the impression in Israel is as you kind of framed it in your question, which is Netanyahu is 2-0. He won on the settlement showdown, and he won on the terms of resuming negotiations. And there's every expectation that will happen again at the end of next month. The carve-out clauses that were created in the initial settlement slowdown were so large as to render the slowdown almost meaningless. If you look on an annual basis, the same number of units have been built this year as were built in any previous year. And one imagines that those carve-out clauses will continue to exist. We'll take a question down here in the front, and then we'll go to the back there.
My name is Elizabeth Bowers, and I'm unaffiliated. I have kind of a clarification question about the polling process. When you're talking about polling Arabs or Arab nations, are you taking into account religious minorities like Palestinian Christians or the Coptic community? And is there any difference of sentiment, or is it negligible? Yeah,
that's a very good question.
Okay, you can answer the question.
I'll answer it very quickly. When we look at, particularly, I don't, by the way, do a poll among Palestinians. I do have a poll among Arab Israelis. It's a separate poll from the annual poll Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. We do it in all the villages, and I make sure, in particular, because they're all clustered in villages in those particular cases, and an opinion varies between Druze, Christians, and Muslims, and we've documented the differences of opinion among them. I make sure that they go particularly to villages that have certain segments of those. In other places, harder to do. In Lebanon, we make sure that we have a good representation of Shia, Christians, and Sunni Muslims and Druze, all four. And where there isn't, we apply weights if we don't have the right mix. Although these weights are always based on data that you're not 100% sure about. In Egypt, we ask people whether, to identify themselves, they're Christian Copt or a Christian or Muslim. And we try to get a representation in the population depending on what the data set says. In all these places, the data set's available. For example, the official estimate of the percentage of Copts in Egypt is suspect. I mean, the Copts suspected, even some officials suspected. It's very hard to get the exact mix, but you have enough in the data to be able to tell differences. There are differences. The differences we see are particularly in Lebanon and among Arab Israelis. Those are the two places where we see real special sectarian differences, and even those you have to take with a bit of a, you have to understand that even Christians are fragmented. For example, in Lebanon, if you go into a Greek Orthodox community versus a Maronite community, you're going to get a slightly different political outlook on some of the issues that we're talking about. And so it's not as simple as it seems, and you always have, you're working with a relatively small sample to be able to fragment it in a meaningful way to do statistical analysis. That's why, by the way, I think all projects really depend on the questions that you want to ask. If I were going to do analysis of a local community and I'm going to look at the differences, then I'd have to have a large sample. I'd have to ask the questions differently. If you're doing what I'm doing, which is essentially trends in the Arab world over time, and I'm correlating them with some variables, some demographic variables, which is what I do in my research. It's a 10-year project, so it's not a snapshot poll. I'm less interested in what Arabs think today as to what's happening in the Arab world. How is it different from 5 years ago? What is it? What do I project it to be? So I haven't even written a scholarly book on this yet. I've written fragmented pieces because I'm waiting the end of the 10-year period to have sustained enough data to be able to do careful analysis of what we have.
There were two questions.
Hi, Cameron Joseph with National Journal. Thanks for doing this. So I know you guys kind of addressed this already. I'm kind of wondering whether it's the Park 51 mosque itself that people are talking about in the Arab world, or whether it's the right-wing hysteria surrounding it, and how much this is actually getting play, whether this is just kind of like some of the elite media outlets are talking about it, or whether this is actually becoming a concern in the Arab world. And I know that this has kind of cropped up as an issue since the poll results came in, but anecdotally, I mean, is this something that's actually playing out in discussions? Is this coffee table discussion, or is this just something that's very much on the periphery? And do you see it moving towards the center at any time in the future with the peace negotiations beginning again?
On that issue, I mean, as I said earlier, I do scan the press on regular. To me, the public opinion poll is only one read, right? You really have multiple reads, which is visits to the region, talks, interactions, as well as reviewing the media. I watch the media regularly, the Arab media regularly, and I appear on the Arab media regularly, and I read the press, and largely on the internet now. Most of them are available on the internet. So I have a little flavor, usually even before I go into the poll, is where the people are. In fact, the way I design the questions is usually informed by my prior analysis of what I hear and what I see. And so what I hear and see is mostly very concerned and critical read on the mosque, but not as pervasive as one might have expected. It's not the burning issue of the day. It is referred to, and it's referenced, but it's not the burning issue. It could become a bigger issue, depending on what happens, obviously, here in some kind of visible escalation of some kind that has a meaning. Right now, it's only a rhetorical debate. It has not had, any real story to report other than this said that and this said that. And it depends, again, on whether somebody's going to pick on it in a fight of anger against the U.S. when people are, in essence, already made up their mind. We have a crisis on the Arab-Israeli issue, or something happens on the Palestine question, and then people are going to start throwing everything at this for taking sides. I could see it becoming an issue. But as of now, it's not the burning issue.
And there was another question in that corner I thought I saw. Yeah.
Khaled El-Giddi, Brookings Institution. I wonder if I might stray a little bit, go a little bit slightly off topic and ask our panel to address the issue of the peace process. As we all know, the talks starting next week. There have been a couple voices lately urging the Obama administration to take a much more regional approach. Marwan Muhashir and others have been arguing that this is actually the key, rather than sort of micro-laterally or micromanaging the issue on the one hand, or simply addressing the bilateral issue, but at a multilateral level, you can actually hit more birds with fewer stones. So I'm wondering if you guys can address the multilateral issue as well, the Syria and the track in particular.
You want to start?
Well, I'll keep it short. I mean, I think it's a very good idea. I think that actually George Bush Sr., when he launched the Madrid process, what was really clever about that process was not only that he brought everybody together. He didn't have a dinner with 3 Arab leaders. He had a summit with every Arab leader and Israel, and he actually then set up a whole series of multilateral conversations between them. And I suspect that the United States had a grand architecture in mind as to what it hoped to accomplish with that. I think if you go the multilateral approach, but you're doing it the same way as you're doing the bilateral approach, which is let's get the Saudis and the Israelis in a room together, and let's get the Jordanians and the Israelis in a room together, and let's get the Syrians and the Israelis in a room together, and then hope that magic happens. That's not going to happen. But if the United States has a grand architecture in mind of what regional security looks like, of what is a rational, reasonable approach that ensures a win-win situation for all the parties, all of Israel's legitimate security needs, all of the Arab needs, if the legitimate needs, if those are all in the U.S. mindset, and there's an architecture that's created, and the multilateral approach then actually, I think, reinforces, and I think it's not only true for the Arab-Israeli peace process, I think it's actually also helpful and true for the U.S. Competition with Iran right now.
Just at the beginning of this administration, through the transition, I co-authored with Steve Cook this proposal on addressing the Middle East peace process for the Council on Foreign Relations in Brookings. It was joint publication, and it went through the transition as a sort of part of the advice on how to approach it. And we have recommended what we call the regional approach, in part because of the connectedness of the issues, in part because of structuring the incentives, in part because you have to deal with potential spoilers. So the idea is right in principle, in my opinion. The question is, where we are now, how do you structure that? How do you bring that? How do you build on it? I do think that making progress on the Syrian-Israeli front is going to be essential for clinching any deal with it. I think the two tracks are somewhat connected. I think it certainly isn't possible, in my own opinion, to do a Syrian-Israeli track without a Palestinian-Israeli track, but I think even the opposite is true. And I think in some ways you're going to have to find a way. You can prioritize, but there has to be a mechanism to address it. Multilateralism at some point is important as an incentive. I think even for Israelis it's important as an incentive. And Mahmoud Abbas is going to also need Arab backing. The issues that he's addressing are not just his issues, like Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a big issue. It's an issue that is that's important regionally beyond Palestine. And even now, to come to direct negotiations, he has needed approval of the Arab League because he feels vulnerable at home. So imagine what happens if you are going to make the kind of concessions on both sides that are going to be required to clinch a deal, how could you do it without a support structure to move forward? So I think all of that clearly is going to have to be built into the process.
I would just absolutely endorse what you just said, Shipley. I think just pretending that the problem of the prohibitively narrow political base of legitimacy that the Palestinian interlocutor carries into the room, just pretending that that doesn't exist, isn't going to make the problem go away. And it's been ignored by this administration from day one and doesn't help.
I don't think it's been ignored.
Well, it's been exacerbated.
They've had a tough time dealing with it, is the better word to put it. They've had a tough time dealing with it.
The public exposition of dealing with it has been to ignore it and to exacerbate it, because Abbas is politically even more emaciated today than he was when this began. And one of the ways around it, as you said, I think on all sides it makes eminent sense to go regional. And there were references to that by Secretary Clinton and Envoy Mitchell last Friday, but they haven't announced a regional process. They've announced a singular track process. I think we have one last question. Are there any up there, Jonathan? No, we've got one question down here, and this will be our last question, then we'll stick to our time and wrap up at 1:45.
Hassan al-Husseini from Saudi Arabia. Hold on one second. Hassan al-Husseini from Saudi Arabia. My question is, what does Obama and the various Arab leaders in the Middle East want out of these peace talks, and why do they want it in 2011? And if I may just help to focus in the question, is it perhaps related to Obama and people like King Abdullah and Erdogan in Turkey and others who want to get over with this problem and pay whatever price is necessary and get it done with? Thank you.
Well, personally, I think if you ask me about interpreting what the president is, obviously I don't know what's in his head. But I think that he genuinely believed from day one that Arab-Israeli peace is an important American interest. And if you look at it actually in both in terms of what he said, how he expressed himself during the campaign, but in the first act that he did when he came and became president, and it's kind of almost puzzling, because when you look at it, here's a president who comes in with two major wars underway and an economy near collapse, and he still says on day one, I want to deal with this issue, and then appoints George Mitchell. So there's no question in my mind that intellectually the president thinks this is really important. And that he's very frustrated that so far he hasn't made as much progress as he would like to make. And I believe in his own mind, he thinks that a breakthrough is possible. And that, obviously since the last year and a half, he may have had a lot of other ideas, but I think the involvement of a president in peacemaking between Israel and the Arabs is an essential requirement of success. I don't think you can mediate Arab-Israeli peace on the cheap. It's too difficult. It's too costly. It requires too much energy. It requires elevating in the national priorities in ways that only a president can do. And so whether or not, in fact, he's going to be able to carry out what he thinks is his mission on that, I don't know. One has to be tested. But I think he genuinely believes that it's doable. Now, on the Arab side, there are two things that we have to separate. I do think that the Palestine issue is an identity issue in the Arab world. I write on identity. My whole project is more about identity. I think it's an identity issue in the Arab world. And we can be cynical about leaders. I'm cynical about leaders. I know they all, first and foremost, want to keep themselves in office. But they're also human beings. And they also have identity, and they're also mobilized. And I think it resonates with ruling elites as well as with everybody else to deal with it. But for them, it varies from country to country. For Jordan, if there's no Palestinian state, there's going to be pressure on the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. This is a Jordanian national interest. For Egypt, the radicalization that this fuels puts pressure on their on their policy, even domestically, puts pressure on them, and they have to worry about what happens in Gaza. Gaza is a big thing for them. They controlled it from 1948 to 1967. If there's no, it's not viable as a state. The Palestinians would not accept it as a state. If Israel doesn't deal with it, they're ending up dealing with it. It has huge ramifications for them. Certainly they have an interest. So you can go country by country. I don't think you can say that they all have the same interest, but I think there is a camp, a sufficient camp, that is interested in having a peace agreement for their own reasons. That if we have a negotiated settlement between Israel and Palestinians that are acceptable to both parties, we can create a support structure to make it happen.
Final word to you, Amjad.
Well, I mean, as a final comment, I think I would just say that it's easy, because this is like the latest iteration in a failed process, to think that, okay, this too will fail and the ramifications and the consequences can't be worse than the previous consequences and ramifications. But I think actually we're moving into a perfect storm period right now, where the failure of this round, the failure of this process, the failure of this actually does mean, as Shibli was saying, that it is really the death of a narrative that the Middle East has held on to for quite a long time, about the role of the United States, about the possibility of peace with Israel, about a two-state solution. And those consequences for the United States, at the same time as we're withdrawing from Iraq, and at the same time as we're struggling in Afghanistan, and at the same time as we're desperately attempting to craft a policy with Iran, that and the original, of course, point of all of this, and we haven't actually captured Osama bin Laden, those things all combined together in 2011 actually, I'm afraid, create a cascading effect. That the failure will have ramifications that are exponential across other issues. And so, we can be cynical about the process, but that's not nearly enough, and it's not useful to anyone. I think what we need to do is be in a problem-solving mode for the next year and desperately attempt to figure out how we can make this process, how we can make this work.
And if demonstrable failure coincides with the transition in Egypt, which you referred to. Well, first I want to obviously thank all of you for joining us this lunchtime. Those of you who've been watching online and the webcast on the New America side and on Steve Clemens' blog, The Washington Note, I want to thank you, Shibli, when you do the book. We'd be delighted to host you back here and have you here again. I don't have to invite you back here, Amjad, because you're here anyway. But thank you so much for joining us, Shibli.
Pleasure.